I knew her for a little ghost that in my garden walked. The wall is high, higher than most, and the green gate was locked. And yet I did not think of that till after she was gone. I knew her by the broad white hat, all ruffled, she had on, by the dear ruffles round her feet, by her small hands that hung, in their lace mitts austere and sweet, her gown's white folds among. I watched to see if she would stay, what she would do, and oh, she looked as if she liked the way I let my garden grow. She bent above my favorite mint with conscious garden grace. She smiled and smiled, there was no hint of sadness in her face. She held her gown on either side to let her slippers show, and up the walk she went with pride, the way great ladies go. And where the wall is built in new, and is of ivy bare, she paused, then opened, and passed through a gate that once was there. Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Schorr Manor podcast, the podcast dedicated to all things Halloween and all things spooky. The poem that we opened up this episode with was called The Little Ghost, written by Edna St. Vincent Millay. It was originally published in Renaissance and Other Poems in 1917. I am your host, Matt Schorr, Clarksville's self-appointed king of Halloween, and I'm going to be going solo this episode. The queen of Halloween, my wife, is sitting this one out while I interview the popular children's author Johnathan Rand, creator of the wildly successful American Chillers series. Johnathan and I talk about all kinds of cool stuff, including like the inspiration for his stories, where these ideas come from, exactly what birthed this whole concept for him of writing spooky stories from his home state of Michigan, and then throughout all the states of America. And not only that, we'll also talk about some of his adult fiction that he writes under his alter ego, Christopher Knight, talking about a lot of the really creepy stories that he's got there, including monsters and stuff inspired by slasher films, one of my favorite genres, including one of his novels that got translated into a film that I still need to see, which was really, really, really cool to find out about. I'm not going to give too much of it away, but I will say this. This is going to be the Schorr Manor podcast's first official two-parter episode. Johnathan and I talked about so many cool things that I just felt like we had to split this off into two episodes to really effectively get all of it. So brace yourself, because there's going to be a really frustrating, maddening cliffhanger ending on this one. But do not worry. Just tune in next week and you'll be able to find out the rest of it and see how everything wrapped up, how it all went down. Not going to give away any more spoilers. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into things right now. We'll start talking with the man, the myth, the legend, the infamous Johnathan Rand. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any children out there who are having trouble sleeping at night, if they are coming to you in the middle of the night with complaints of nightmares and monsters under their beds, the man I'm on the phone with right now is probably to blame. This is, of course, the author of the widely successful American Chillers series, a truly terrifying set of novels, Johnathan Rand. Johnathan, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing great, man. How are you?
I am pretty good. I think it's safe to say I'm not waxing into hyperbole there. That's all totally accurate stuff that I said.
Well, it's not like I created the monsters under the bed. I've just exposed them for what they really are, so.
There you go. I think Wes Craven said something similar once. That's pretty good. You're in good company there. All right. Well, we'll definitely get into American Chillers, but I would like to go back to where everything kind of started for you. American Chillers, I guess, is where maybe you could say you went mainstream, but this started a little bit more locally for you in your home state of Michigan with Michigan Chillers. Am I right?
Yeah, and it actually, really, when you want to, it would even back up even before that. I had been working in radio and television for a number of years, and one of the I've been on the air live at some classic rock stations, some top 40 stations, and I kind of fell into more of a forte of writing and producing radio and television commercials, and I did that for probably 4 or 5 years. But in the meantime, growing up, I've always loved to read, and I mean, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I was always, so fascinated with the old Godzilla movies and anything scary of that nature. I was always reading scary books, and even some of just the classics like the Hardy Boys. But for me, that love of reading never dwindled through school. I know, a lot of people hit their teenage years in high school, and and that kind of takes a back seat. And for me, it never really did. I think there might have been a period of time, right out of when I got my first job when I was 18 or so. Where I kind of slacked a little bit, but I was always a real voracious reader, and I wanted to explain that because leading up to what I was doing and how I got started, writing, that's really what I got to a point where I kept getting ideas for stories, and I would think, wow, somebody should write a book about that, or oh gosh, that's a great idea, somebody should write a book about that. And finally, one day I thought, maybe it's maybe that somebody should be me, and I started with a couple of adult fiction novels, and they did pretty good regionally. And I kind of, from there, I was working on an adult novel, and I started getting this idea for this whole, Michigan Chillers thing. And it kind of, the whole inspiration of that was a lot of the stories I had read when I was growing up, and I would think, I would love to do this. But I was also kind of stuck with the idea that, what am I going to do that's new? I would go into these gigantic bookstores, and I would see thousands and thousands of books, and I would think, what could I do that would be, that would be different from a lot of this that I see already. And I came up with this whole idea for this concept of Michigan Chillers, and each book being based in a different city around the state. And that's really kind of how the whole thing got launched. I started with some of the books. That first one was like Mayhem on Mackinac Island. If you've ever been to Michigan, in fact, a lot of people do come to Michigan just for that fact. Mackinac Island is a real popular tourist destination, and I thought, well, I can base this book here, and then kind of pick out some other cities that I'm familiar with, and then maybe if it really starts to catch on, then I could branch off and I could do like American Chillers, and and essentially that's exactly what happened. I started with the Michigan Chillers first, and then a couple of years later, the American Chillers came along.
How many Michigan Chillers did you get out there before you moved on to the American Chillers series?
There were 10, and it took me I would say the first 10 books took me about a year and a half, just over a year and a half to do. And I think, now it's kind of funny because I've slowed down a little bit. At the time when what happened was the first Michigan Chillers came out in March of the year 2000. And they really did kind of take off pretty quick, which I was very, very fortunate to have regionally, they really did with a Michigan audience, and then throughout the Midwest, they got a real big audience really quick. And by October of that year, I'd wound up quitting my job doing radio commercials and just throwing all of my time into writing, as well as speaking. I had started getting phone calls, and I was being booked to travel around and do speaking engagements and book signings and such. But so the first 10 books came out between year 2000 and 2001, and then the first American Chillers came out in December of 2001.
The Michigan Chillers, since we've gotten to know each other, I'm not knocking the American Chiller series at all. It's fantastic, but
sure.
The Michigan Chillers kind of appeals to me a little bit, I guess, ever since we got to know each other, because it was through you that I became exposed to Michigan as a state. I had never been there, and had we never met, probably there's a good chance I never would have ended up there. So it just, I don't know, since I was there and visited it, the state just kind of fascinated me. And so stories about it, they take me back. And so, yeah, I've read several of the Michigan Chillers series, and a handful of the American Chillers. I've kind of focused on the ones that, take place in my home state of Kentucky, the Kentucky Komodo Dragons. That was hard to pass up.
Yeah.
Now that I'm in Tennessee, I'll have to pick that one up too, though.
Well, I think too. Michigan it's obviously it's my home state. I'm from the state. I've been all over, crisscrossed the state. Just I don't know how many. Literally, I mean, when I say hundreds of times, I think I've crisscrossed it hundreds of times. But I think a lot of people, if they haven't been here, or if they have not been to Michigan, they have this idea that Michigan is it's Detroit, it's the Motor City, and Detroit really is a great city, and it's got a lot of things to offer, but it's just one aspect of our state. It's only one facet of the state. And if you've only experienced Detroit, you really haven't experienced Michigan, because you can go from a real busy metropolitan city such as Detroit, and literally within a couple of hours, you can be in the forested regions, and I mean, like you're in the Northwest Territories. And for me, that's where this is. That really is my home. I was born in Pontiac, which is outside of Detroit, and then my family moved to Grayling, a small town in northern Lower Michigan, and then I moved even farther north, which is where I reside now. Very, very small town on Mullet Lake, and very idyllic. We're real close to the airport, which is handy, and then real close to the main artery, I-75. So it really is the best of both worlds for me to be able to be up here and to be able to write about all these really great things that are in the States.
It really is a gorgeous state. When I was there, talking about the Michigan Chiller series, now those appeal to me because they are part of that state. Your adult fiction also pretty much exclusively takes place in Michigan, and I have actually read all of your adult novels. And first one I read was a great book called Ferocity, which was this is of course praiseworthy for me, saying that it reminded me a lot of those Sci-Fi Channel, Mega Shark, Crocosaurus type monster flicks, but with a little bit more character development.
I had so much fun writing that book. That was actually the third book that I wrote, and it was one that had been in my mind for a long time. Probably, I think the infancy of that book began probably when I was even in grade school, because as you and I had mentioned, I alluded to like Godzilla and all these movies growing. I mean, I just love the whole concept of the monster movies. Growing up, we used to have a channel. It's an old UHF channel. Before we had hundreds of channels, we only had 3. Actually, we had 4. And this one channel it came in very, very fuzzy, but they used to have Monster Week. Long before there was ever a Shark Week, there was Monster Week on Channel 60 in the Detroit area. And they would do that once a year, and I just loved that. I would wait for that week, and, the Godzilla movies would be on, and, anything that was just giant and awful and, going to be, causing catastrophic, apocalyptic nightmares among the population, that I was just all for. And Ferocity is kind of like that. I mean, it really is. In essence, it's a freshwater Jaws. It's about a giant muskellunge, which is a sport fish, a game fish. We've actually got them here in Mullet Lake, and and they get big. They get up to 5.5, 6 feet, and when you see them in the water, they look menacing. They look very scary. And I thought, man, this is a perfect setting for this giant muskellunge, and he could be 12 feet long, and I've read stories when I was doing research for this novel. I've read there are actual stories. In fact, one of the more recent ones was out of Duluth, Minnesota. A girl got, I don't know how many stitches in the ball of her foot. She was sitting on the dock, and this muskellunge came up and grabbed her by the foot. So this was that was just a fun book to write, in many different ways.
Yeah, it was really fun to read. It's sort of it's like a Michigan Chiller for adults, because it follows kind of a similar formula. You've got this big monster at the heart of the whole story that everyone has to deal with. Only instead of kids dealing with it, it's adults.
And I think, I would agree. I tried to put, the fun thing that I do, at least what's fun for me, is between the difference between writing for kids and writing for adults. Kids aren't as patient. You've really got to give them some sweetness, and you've got to make it happen a little faster. Now, adults are more patient, and they don't want that. They won't tolerate that. They want the story fleshed out a bit more, and they want a little more character development. And that's a little bit, it makes it more fun for me because I get to explore both of those two genres between the adults and the kids. And I was able to do that with Ferocity. But the interesting thing is, it was during Ferocity that I had the whole concept for this whole Michigan Chillers. And what happened was, in fact, if I hadn't written Ferocity, there wouldn't be a Michigan Chillers or American Chillers or any of these other books that I write for kids. There's a fictitious town you'll remember in Ferocity. It's called Coorville. And it's on Mullet Lake, but Coorville is kind of, it's just more of a fictionalized town that really doesn't represent any particular town, just kind of an amalgamation of several of the villages.
You're shattering my delusions here. I thought this was a real place.
Well, it's really, it's real close, and that's the thing. People say, well, I bet you're writing about Mullet Village, or you're writing about Indian River, or you're writing about Top of the Beach. I do mention some of those locales in the book, but Coorville is a little, it's a little more nondescript, so you can kind of put that anywhere. But in the course of writing that, and I wanted to kind of describe Coorville for the reader, and I was kind of trying to come up and compare it to a beverage. I thought, if you were to put everything about northern Michigan, the clean air, the fresh water, the beautiful scenery, the acres and acres of forest land and the wildlife and all this, what they call, pure Michigan, which is not a slogan that was even around then. But if you put it in a bottle and you sold it as a beverage, what would you call it? Well, in my book, in Ferocity, I settled on, I called it a Coorville Cooler. And, but one of the names that I jotted down on a piece of paper was a Michigan Chiller. And I kept thinking about it, Michigan Chiller, this kind of goes along with my idea of, scary books for kids. And each one could be based in a different city. And that's really how the whole thing began. So if there had not been a Ferocity, a book about a giant fish for adults, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you about Michigan Chillers.
It's, I enjoyed all of your books that I read, but that one, I think it's safe to say, of all the adult fiction you've got, it's the most fun. It's just a fun ride. It's a big roller coaster. You've got thrills and chills, if I can use that word as well. But yeah, it's just exciting. It's fun. And, you put it down and you're almost kind of sad the story's over because man, that was fun. That was exciting.
I think well, thank you for saying that. I do appreciate it. I think what I hear, which is a lot of fun for me, is from the creator and the writer aspect, is that people will tell me that they come up on vacation, they pick it up, and they read it while they're on vacation, and I've had people that actually say, "Thank you very much for messing up my vacation. I don't go in the water again." And I think that's a big compliment. And in fact, even for myself, when I wrote that book, it was for me it took me 2 years to get back in the water. I mean, and I was a scuba diver at the time, and I just it kind of freaked me out. And when you see these fish, when you're and you do on occasion, while you're snorkeling, or if you're in a freshwater lake, especially Mullet Lake or Burt Lake, which is where we live, the fish are very unnerving. They're when you see these things, they kind of spook you, and they're very, very large. So when I hear somebody say, I couldn't get back in the water because I wasn't sure what was in there, I'm thinking, hey, that's great. I did my job. Another satisfied customer,
Yeah, the Steven Spielberg of Michigan. That's a good title to have. Well, one of my favorite memories from that story is actually behind the scenes thing, because I actually got to correspond with you a little bit as I was reading it. You told me your wife was proofing it for you at one time, and there's a scene in there where there's a dog that some real nasty character is using as bait to try to catch this nasty muskellunge. And I'm not going to throw out any spoilers here, but your wife called down how much trouble you were going to be in if this dog got killed.
Yeah, you can tell. I mean, I can tell by the tone of my wife's voice. I had printed up the manuscript. This was even before I went to my editor. I printed up the manuscript and I gave it to my wife to read. And I was downstairs. I was writing or doing something, and I heard that tone in her voice, and it was very loud, calling from upstairs. And she said, if this dog dies, I knew I was going to be in a lot of trouble if there was not an agreeable solution in the eyes of my wife. So,
well, that's all I'm going to say about that. If anybody wants to know how things work out for this dog, you'll have to pick that book up. Well, moving on from there, we'll dive into the American Chiller series. How things really kind of exploded for you, it seems like, with the beginning of that series. Would that be correct? Because you've gone to 45 books at this point, covering each state.
Yeah, I'm not quite. There will be one for every state. I'm not quite done yet. I've still got a few states that I'm working on, and and you're correct. Each one is based in a different state, and it really was just an expansion of the Michigan Chillers. And for me, what was really exciting and gratifying is that I had this idea. I thought, okay, I'm going to start with these Michigan Chillers, and I'll see what happens. And then, if they do take off, I can on a bigger plane field, I can explore this whole thing with America, and then do it, state by state, do this thing, American Chillers. And so I had planned on it, but you never really know if that's going to work out or not. I was very hopeful, but an interesting thing happened right around my fourth book and fifth book. I started getting letters in the mail, and it wasn't just like one or two. I mean, it really was 3, 4, 5, and then pretty soon it was 8, 10, 12, 15 a day, from kids not only in Michigan but from kids in different states. And they were saying, hey, you could write this book about a different state. You could I'm from Wisconsin, you could write about this, and they would send me these title suggestions, and it was really gratifying because I thought, the kids have these kids have picked up exactly what I had been thinking, and were kind of almost urging me to do this. And so it was kind of cool, and I made those plans, but I thought, well, I'm going to finish up the Michigan Chillers. I'm going to do 10 of those, just a nice even 10 set of 10 books in the Michigan Chiller series, and then I'll branch off into the American Chiller series. And that's what I did. There was one book in the interim called Ghost in the Graveyard, which was the first book in the Adventure Club series. It's a collection of 6 short stories that was kind of written, kind of in between the two, but that the first book in the American Chillers was entitled The Michigan Mega Monsters. That was obviously based on my home state, and that came out on December 12th of the year 2001. And I had planned at the time to continue writing the Michigan Chillers, but the American Chillers all of a sudden really did the same thing the Michigan Chillers had done. They really started getting popular, so I started traveling out of state. And so I thought, well, I'll put the Michigan Chillers series on hold, and I did. It was probably another more than that, maybe 5 or 6 years before another Michigan Chillers was released. And I'm still continuing on the Michigan Chillers. They're just so much fun. I love our state. There's lots of great things to write about here.
One rule I believe you had for the American Chiller series was it that you had to visit each state before you would write about it?
Yeah, and that is a rule that is held true except for 2 books. There's 2 books that I have written. Now, one of the books is Massachusetts. Now, I've been to Massachusetts a number of times, visiting schools. I've done some book signings. So I've been, out and about. But I had originally, I thought, Boston or just outside of Boston would be a great place for the setting of a book. But I came across this place in Massachusetts that I'd never been to. It's called October National Forest. And I love the name of it. It just sounded so cool and creepy. And I thought, October National Forest, what a great setting for a book. And I'd already chosen the title, this Maniac Martians Marooned in Massachusetts. And I thought, with a few tweaks of my outline here, I could change this. So I did all of my research online. I did all of my research just by, doing Google searches. I would, and there's an enormous amount of, people that have been camping there. So there's pictures and there's all kinds of things you could find out. And I felt I was comfortable enough writing about the places, without actually having, to have actually been to October National Forest. So that's one instance. And then the other instance is Alaska. That's book number 42. And I wrote Arctic Anacondas of Alaska. And I have always wanted to go to Alaska. I knew that when it was time to write this book, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get away and go there. So I thought, well, I can't do this. Well, I have a friend in Fairbanks, and he was like, you know what? I'll just work on the story, And he said, if you have any questions, just, you can talk to me, or I'll shoot you back, information back and forth. So it was a combination of, my own research, and then having his input on my story. And the first thing obviously was, he said, well, snakes, there are no snakes in Alaska, and I didn't know that. And I said, well, there are now. And this is fiction, and not only are there snakes, there are anacondas, and they live in the ice and the snow. And that's the great, I had so much fun just creating that story, because fiction is really terrific, and there has to be an element of truth. I mean, people will believe your story if you make it believable, if you give them a reason. So my reasoning is that through the long period of evolution, these snakes had adapted to the snow and the ice, and because of the fact that, Alaska is it's gigantic. It's so vastly unexplored. So it could be very feasible that a species or a reptile or amphibian could, exist in the forest without anybody knowing about it. And so I didn't really have to explain it too much. I thought that was a good enough reason. That sounded relatively plausible, and it seems to have worked. I know kids that really thought that was a pretty cool idea. And I don't think anybody's going to be heading to Alaska to try to catch anacondas in the ice or snow anytime soon. But I think I was really overall very well pleased with the way it came out.
Have you been to Alaska since writing that one?
No, I haven't, and I have not yet been to Hawaii. And my wife and my publicist keep pushing me on that. And it's crazy. I don't have a desire to go there. I mean, I don't want to offend anybody from Hawaii. I'm sure the state's wonderful. My wife has been there, and she says it's just absolutely terrific. It just is awesome. And I said, well, here's the idea. I said, why don't you go? You grab Sue, my publicist. You guys go for a couple weeks and do all this research for me, and then I'll write the book. And so they're all for that. So that has not yet happened, but I'm sure that's going to happen in the future.
So Hawaii being the most challenging state to visit, I guess that'll be the last one in the series?
It's probably going to be, pretty one of the last ones, or whenever my wife and my publicist decide to visit. Sure, it'll be shortly after that.
So can I get you to reveal what the title is for that one, or possible titles?
Well, I'm still kind of going back and forth. I wrote down, at one point I had come up with all 50 titles, but I've kind of tweaked a little bit here and there. So I'm thinking of something like Horrible Hedgehogs or Horrible Hamsters. It's such an outlandish, goofy title, and yet, you can make things really horrifying. Like I said with my anaconda story in Alaska, if you can make it believable, the reader will follow along with it, but you've got to tell the truth. So however these hamsters get to Hawaii or hedgehogs and whatever happens, it's got to be believable.
There it is, revealed here for the first time, the title for the final chapter of American Chillers. But one thing my wife and I were talking about with this series, each book, it's basically an anthology series. Each story it's not really connected to the other, apart from the way each book ends with a sort of teaser into the next one. Each kid finishes out their adventure and then meets another kid who says, oh, if you think that's bad, you should see what I went through a while back. So in effect, they are connected, and they're kind of prequels to one another. So the series keeps going back to where it all started. So if Hawaii is going to be the final book, then that's going to actually be where all the terror of the American Chillers started, was all the way out in the ocean in Hawaii.
Yeah, and I started doing that. I wanted, with the very first book in the Michigan Chillers series, and I wanted to somehow connect the reader to the next book, but I didn't want to kind of leave a cliffhanger for the reader to think, okay, now I have to read the next book, and I have to read the next book. All the characters, like in the characters in book 1, Mayhem on Mackinac Island, those characters are different from the characters in book number 2, which is Terror Stalks Traverse City. But I wanted to come up with some kind of a unique connection to give the reader an idea of what was coming next in the series. And it worked. It was Tim and Sandy. They had this incredibly terrifying, wonderful adventure on Mackinac Island, and they're safe. They solved the problem, and they're thinking about it, and and they meet up with this kid from Traverse City, and Matt's telling them, if you think what happened to you on Mackinac Island is scary, wait till you hear about, what happened to me in Traverse City last winter, because that was 10 times worse. And they're like, really? Well, tell us all about it. And so that begins, that's actually the end right there of Mayhem on Mackinac Island. And then in the same book, you're at the end of book 1, Michigan Chillers, you can turn the page and begin the first 4 chapters, or 3 or 4 chapters of book number 2. It's kind of like you get a little teaser of what is coming next. And I followed that format throughout the Michigan Chillers and continued it on with the American Chillers as well.
It's an effective hook. It's a lot like comic books, like the story ends with Superman putting Lex Luthor in jail and Metropolis is saved and everything's great. And then on the last panel, this new monster climbs out of the sewers and it's like, well, what's going to happen in the next issue?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a great way, for me, it's just a wonderful exercise in creativity. But I think people really enjoy it, especially, kids at that age. They get hooked on a series, they get hooked on books. I remember what it was like for me when I started to really get into books. That once I found out there were several books in a series, I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to get the next one. I was constantly going to the library and looking for the next book. And so it's a lot of fun for me to see that among a fan base that has continuously grown for 20 years now.
One other book I should mention, going back to the adult fiction, is Bestseller. That one along with Ferocity, might be favorites of mine. Just it reminds me so much of the slasher movies that I got so into when I was a teenager, that I watched way younger than I should have. But you can thank you had your Monster Week. I had stuff like USA Up All Night, AMC Fear Friday, and of course TNT Monster Vision. Anybody out there who knows about those? And yeah, and I used to actually get excited whenever there was an actual Friday the 13th, because that meant there was going to be a Friday the 13th marathon that night.
Yeah.
But that's what Bestseller really reminded me a lot of, even though there's not a huge body count in it, but just the feel of it, everything that's going on, because like one of the main things with slasher films is like there was this horrible thing that happened that got covered up, and it's coming back to haunt everybody. And in its own way, with Bestseller, that's sort of what this main character, this literary agent, is dealing with. Some of like the way she has treated writers in the past, it's coming back to haunt her.
Yeah, and I wanted to do something with that. Is the story in essence is relatively simple, and I fought to keep it that way because I didn't want to expand it and bring in so many different characters. I really wanted to bring the reader into the mind of both the literary agent, the protagonist, and as well as this serial killer, this psychopath, and allow the reader to kind of get into their heads. And through this cat and mouse game, so the reader is given much more information as to what's going on, obviously, than the protagonist knows. This poor literary agent from New York City is gone away to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is a very desolate cabin in the middle of the wilderness to just kind of get away, read some manuscripts, and be alone for a while, and has no idea that this deranged guy is out there in the forest. For the conception of that book was, I wish this would happen more often, but it just doesn't. And it happened when I was it was shortly after I had started writing the Michigan Chillers series. I'd awoken in the middle of the night with this idea. It was like almost like fleshed out, completely fleshed out. And I flopped open my laptop and I just tapped away, and I just wrote an outline as much as I could remember of what had come to me in the middle of the night. And it took me a couple of hours. I closed my laptop and that was it. And I kept thinking about it. This was a story that over the course of that spring kept coming back to me, and I'm like, okay, I could do this, and I would make notes, and I could do this, and I knew at the time as well that there was no possible way I was going to have the time to write this, because it was, the Michigan Chillers were really taking off. I was traveling, and my time was just, I was a bad manager of my time. Well, I wouldn't say I was a bad manager of my time. It's just that I did not have time for a project like this. So I told myself, and I rented this cabin way up in the middle of the Upper Peninsula for 2 weeks, which is similar to what Ann Harper did, exactly what Ann Harper did, actually, the protagonist of bestseller. And I stayed up there, and I wrote this book in 2 weeks, and it was furious writing. It was just like nonstop writing, and my whole lifestyle changed. And I would sleep for 4 or 5 hours, maybe in the afternoon, and I would write until I got tired, and I would take a nap, and I was a wreck after 2 weeks. But I wrote it, and I had it down, and I'm not sure exactly how many words, probably 100,000 words in the 2 weeks time. I had the entire story on this one big lump. Now that doesn't mean that I was done with it, because I went back. When I went back, I went home, and I spent the next few months rewriting and making a lot of changes. But that's exactly how that happened, and I was very, very pleased with the way the story came out. And that was actually turned into a movie a couple of years ago, which was pretty cool.
I was going to say, yeah, speaking of slasher films, this one got turned into a movie. What was that experience like?
Yeah, that was fun. And it was a cool experience to see your book and your characters come to life. And I think they did a fabulous job. It was filmed in Michigan, not too far from where I live, as a matter of fact. My regret with this whole thing was that I didn't get a chance. I would have loved to have been on scene. I was there. I had a little tiny short bit in the movie, like 12 words, which it was fun. But I wasn't able to really be there to watch. I was completely fascinated with the whole process. I just thought it was so cool. But I was so busy at the time. It was filmed in the fall, and I was just traveling all over, and wasn't able to do it. So ultimately, that's one thing that if I do this again, I would love to spend more time. I don't necessarily have to have my hands in it. I don't need to be I'm not an actor, and that's not my desire. But I would love to be on scene to watch it unfold. I think that'd be so cool.
Yeah, I need to get my hands on that one. I haven't had a chance to watch that. I'd probably get a kick out of seeing that one translated to film.
Yeah, that was it was. I think the characters that were chosen, the characters cast in those roles, did an absolutely phenomenal job, and the cinematography, the story. I mean, it really got that creepiness from the book and put it up on the screen.
All right, to be continued. Make sure you check back next week to see how everything winds down. You'll also find out about the spooky camp for young writers that Johnathan heads up, and you can also find out about a truly terrifying prank that I got to be a part of while I was there one time, so don't want to miss that. Very good times ahead. As we wind down, I'll go ahead and let you guys know how you can reach out to us if you would like. Schorr Manor is on Facebook, on our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/Schorr Manor. That's SCHORRMANOR. All sorts of great spooky content there, including updates about this show and other things that we got going on, not to mention my horrifying webcomic, Moby Dick Back from the Deep, if you want to check that out, by all means. You also have the opportunity there to buy t-shirts if you want to show some real support. Show all your friends how awesome you are. Show some love for Schorr Manor. By all means, do that. And speaking of support, we have a Patreon page, patreon.com/Schorr Manor. All kinds of cool rewards there, including early access to episodes just like this one. Please feel free to check that one out. And if you'd like to reach out to me directly, here are some ways that you can do it. I am on Twitter @TheMattSchorr and Instagram @TheSchorr. And if you want to reach me directly by email, you can do so at mattschorr@hotmail.com. And last but not least, I have my own website, www.mattschorr.net. If you'd like to find out some information about me over there, there's all kinds of stuff, past stuff that I've written, this podcast, other things that I've got going on. By all means, go check that out. So as we wind things down, one last time, I'll just remind you again, make sure to come back next week for the last half of my interview with Johnathan Rand. And in the meantime, stay spooky, and as always, happy haunting.